This video is brought to you by the Concrete Pumping Association of Australia. For more information, please visit our website or give us a call today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first member briefing webinar for 2019. And as a consequence, I'd like to move to the first slide for today's presentation and just give you a bit of an insight into how we're going to run today's webinar. In terms of the goals for today's webinar, we'll be basically giving you a bit of a timeline and journey and some of the changes that have happened with regard to AS 2550 Part 15. Joining me for today's webinar will be Anthony Mattar from CPAA and David Bond from CPAA Machinery. Both Anthony and David were the nominated representatives from the Concrete Pumping Association, along with myself as the drafting leader for the project. Towards the end, we'll have an opportunity to go through all your questions and answers and provide answers at the end. So without any further ado, I've got about 30 slides, and I'm expecting that to take us about 35-40 minutes to go through. As I said, I want to set the scene to start with and then take you through the journey that we've been on and then focus on some specific aspects. As you can appreciate, we're not going to go through page by page, but as I said, after this webinar, if there are any other additional questions that we haven't been able to address today, feel free to reach out to the association or some of the websites that we'll offer as further information. So let's move on to our sort of first slide. But let me just start with giving you a bit of a context about the concrete pumping industry. I think it's always helpful to help us understand who we are and where we fit in the world. So one of the first things that I like to demonstrate to people is that we're a significant group of businesses operating within a wider construction industry. And in that sense, there are over 1,300 concrete pumping related businesses operating across Australia. Just to put that into context, a little over 21% of those are members of our association. As it says there, there's approximately about 8,000 pieces of plant operating from small grout pumps right through to tower or separate placing booms. And again, of our membership, they control a significant proportion of that, of around about 62%. And the industry also employs a fairly significant number of people, and we estimate that to be around about 13,000 people, which is a part of an overall construction industry of about $11.7 billion. So in summary, we are a fairly large and sizable contributor to a large service part of the industry. So we're here to talk about Australian standards. So let me give you a bit of a quick introduction to how we got where we are today. So 2550 Part 15 was first published in 1994. I suppose, suffice to say, I'm not aware of the document development process leading up to the 1994 edition. There are no records within Australian standards, and therefore I can't offer any context about how the 1994 document came together. However, when the committee got together, we did do some investigations into elements of the document, and I think one of the interesting elements is that the 6-yearly mandatory requirements were at the time seen as a response to industry accidents that were occurring. Suffice to say, 1994, the document was published. Standards Australia would typically undertake a review every 10 years. And in about 2008 or 14 years after the published document, the first review was initiated. I suppose at that initial review, the code was managed by a committee called ME005, which predominantly dealt with cranes, or is the principal code committee for cranes. So just to set the record straight, the first review was triggered under the Cranes Code Committee. What we call a subcommittee commenced working on that review in 2008 through to about 2013. A subcommittee in Australian standards speak is not actually a fully fledged technical committee made up of industry bodies. It's really a subset of individuals that are considered to be subject matter experts or have some experience in that space or can demonstrate they have a vested interest in the standard. I suppose one of the disadvantages or cons of a subcommittee is that it's not restricted by standards governance or committee management processes. They can get on and do stuff without the rigours of minuting meetings, etc. But as I understood, this particular committee operated with similar sort of, I suppose, processes. One of the disadvantages, however, of a subcommittee is that there is no accountability back to the nominating organisations. It's seen as a set of individuals. There's no requirement for them to consult with any industry people. And also, I think there's potential for influence from commercial interests. I suppose the point that I'd like to make is that after the committee's 5 years of work, the document wasn't published. There was some 400 plus public comments which were seen to be unresolved or were dismissed by the subcommittee. And as a consequence, there was ongoing uncertainty within the industry. The association was being inundated with more and more questions, and it all resulted in what I consider to be a series of ad hoc, inconsistent practices across all of the states. And many of the regulators had sought to fill those voids by developing their own codes of practices or updating them, which led to, I suppose, what would be considered to be fragmented requirements across many of the jurisdictions or states. And for those of you that operate across multiple states, I think you know full well what I'm referring to. So, 2014, association appointed our company, HBM Group, to essentially manage the association. We do lots of different industry associations, and we immediately undertook a review of what had transpired in the years leading up to 2013. And I think, suffice to say, our draft report that we tabled for the management committee identified a number of problems with the subcommittee's work. And I suppose out of the public comment process, a number of issues weren't addressed. Inconsistent terminology, really important missing definitions. There was still some uncertainty around the application of the standard online, mobile and satellite or separate placing booms. So within the current document, there was clearly application to a mobile boom pump. There was clearly no reference to the separate placing boom or satellite or tower, and there were limited references to line pumps. So again, there was a lack of clarity within the existing document 1994 and the review or the draft that had been developed up to 2013. I think the most controversial issue was there was a continued approach towards a prescriptive requirement for 6-yearly mandatory strip downs, and there was increasing conflict with a document that was nearly 25 years out of date with international standards, moreover, manufacturers' requirements for modern equipment. And I think the most controversial issue was some legal action which potentially was being touted at the draft, which was circulated for public comment as potentially triggering technical barriers to trade. And I won't go into the detail of that other than to say standards have a fairly clear responsibility to ensure that they don't incorporate standards with technical barriers that prevent trade under the WTO, World Trade Organization. So after that review, we submitted a report to Standards Australia for their consideration. After a series of meetings with Standards Australia over 2015, Standards Australia decided to collapse the subcommittee which was formed under the Cranes Code Committee, Subcommittee 15, and a series of open forums were conducted in 2015 to really engage with our key stakeholders. Out of that 2015 meeting, we then drafted a project proposal, and then we were essentially provided approval in early 2016, and a new technical committee, ME091, was formed and constituted. And on the right-hand side, you'll see some of the organisations which were involved, like New South Wales Government, Engineers Australia, Cement Concrete Aggregates Australia, CICA, which is the Crane Industry Council, unions such as the CMFU and the ACTU, the Non-Destructive Testing Organisation, Concrete Institute, Master Builders, WorkSafe in Victoria, amongst others. So I suppose as a committee, it was broadly representative of all the industry's interests, and we had a sufficient engagement from regulators. Now, we approached all state regulators, but New South Wales and Victoria were, I suppose, the ones that accepted our invitation and saw value in participating. So their engagement was guaranteed in the committee's constitution. Out of that series of stakeholder forums and the project proposal, which was actually accepted and adopted as our terms of reference, these were probably loosely the 5 key points for the committee's review, and these were considered to be the terms of reference for the committee. The first one was a general document-wide terminology update and looking to incorporate new definitions, and we looked at international codes to incorporate those where appropriate. Definitions for line pump, boom pump and satellite placing booms to be incorporated. Expanded and improved definitions for the various competent persons across the scope of activities within the standard. And I think, as I've highlighted here, to consider alignment of inspection and maintenance requirements with manufacturers' own codes of practices or operating manuals, if we want to use a more generic term, and consider elements of international codes. In particular, we look towards the EN 12001 series as being a document that had only recently gone through a major revision. Lastly, where appropriate, we considered alignment with various state and federal WorkSafe regulations and codes of practice and or guidelines. So with regards to that highlighted item, alignment of inspection and maintenance requirements, that wasn't necessarily an easy undertaking. And luckily, the Concrete Pumping Association had already commenced some work with development of some national codes of practice or operating guidelines that it had started. And Anthony and David, amongst others, had looked at a fairly broad church of international, national, and also manufacturers' individual operating and maintenance manuals. And out of that, we learnt a lot with regard to how out of date, I suppose, the 1994 document was, but moreover, the differences that occur between manufacturers and how do we incorporate those into a document which is seen as a general standard for concrete pumping or safe practices. I suppose the one that was considered to be a template to be looked at was the EN 12001. Anyway, a bit more on that later on. So now that brings us up to 2016. The Code Committee kicks off and the document's published in 2019. Now, I'm not going to give you a blow-by-blow description of what transpired over that period other than to say on the screen from May 2016 through to January 2019 when Standards republished the updated version, there was a considerable amount of effort placed in engaging and consulting and work done on behalf of the Code Committee. I think the point I'd like to highlight here is that in April 2018, when we went for the first public comment, out of that process, we received a total of 129 comments received, many of them fairly repetitive, but in contrast to the 2013 review, where there were 400 plus comments, the committee, I think, felt somewhat satisfied that it had done the hard yards and somewhat vindicated that it had done the research and produced the evidence to support the changes in the document. So really that brings us up to the publication of the document. So I'm going to spend the next sort of 20 minutes going over really the summary of changes. And as I mentioned, it's going to be difficult for me to spend sort of a time on going it through a line-by-line perspective, but I'm going to focus on the key elements and then focus in on some key issues as we get to them. So in terms of the summary of changes, Section 1, definitions, concrete placing equipment is incorporating line pump, mobile boom pumps and satellite placing booms. With regards to competent persons for various inspections, there are now detailed definitions for each of these different inspections: setup, erection and dismantling, each use, which is equivalent to daily and monthly and periodic inspections. Now, I'll expand on the definition of periodic a little bit later in the document, so just be aware that that is a new term that we've incorporated. I suppose in all, we've gone from a handful of definitions to the incorporation of more than 30 plus new definitions, which kind of clearly delineate what we're talking about within the document, and it leaves little room for interpretation. I think one of the important things that our office receives on a number of occasions with regards to standards is interpretation of various sections. And just for clarity's sake, we've also incorporated the meaning of statements such as may, should, or shall. So may is really another word for an option in the document. Should really refers to a recommendation, and a shall statement is really a mandatory requirement as a part of the standard. So if there's ever any lack of clarity, the document gives advice about how each of those statements should be treated. The next sections are 1 through to 4, planning, section 2, some fairly minor updates, section 3, again minor updates, and setup and erection and dismantling, minor updates. With regard to section 5, that's probably an area we focused a fair amount of energy on, and in particular, we included a checklist with regard to each type of plant. And I've just got a snapshot from the document just to highlight an example of how that table operates. So a particular condition or operation condition is stated, and I've highlighted item C. Whilst in operation, the boom shall not contact any object. Now, for a line pump, that's probably not applicable, but for a boom or a satellite placing boom, that is important. So that's a statement, a mandatory statement within the operational guideline. Another example that I wanted to draw on, and I must admit we probably at the association get a question on this just about every week with regard to outriggers or stabilisers. And I know many state safe work regulators have equally got opinions or views about this particular issue. But I suppose the way that the association has articulated this is that modern placing equipment has sophisticated sensors built in within the equipment to allow it to be operated either fully extended or short-rigged. That is really something that is permitted by the individual piece of plant or equipment. So we have therefore incorporated within item F, where permitted by the manufacturer, short conditions and limitations stipulated by the manufacturer or the competent person shall be observed before operating the plant, unfolding and raising the boom. Again, not applicable to a line pump, but clearly applicable to a boom pump. I think that helps clarify in the document about how that should be undertaken. And if your piece of plant or equipment does not have a manufacturer that stipulates the ability to short rig, then therefore you need to observe the manufacturer's operating instructions. I think the next item, which is in section 5, is around manning, and I know that the association's taken, again, many calls on this issue, and in one of the drafts that we were considering, it was viewed by state WorkSafe regulators that they wanted a minimum of 2 people to be operating on a piece of plant at any one time. And I know that across our 1,300 concrete pumping operators, there are a lot of single-man operations, and that's, I suppose, part of how they operate their business and have for many years. And that having a mandatory requirement for 2 people was seen as potentially, essentially closing their business down, or didn't want to operate in that way. The manning discussion went on fairly lengthy, for a lengthy period within the Code Committee, but ultimately we moved towards a recommendation statement, and that is that the concrete placing equipment should be manned by a minimum of 1 pump operator or 1 boom operator, and then a line hand where required and a spotter where required. It's important to note, however, that the boom operator and the pump operator may be the same person, with the one stipulation that they shall not manipulate the boom or handle the hose simultaneously. And there are some notes associated with the standard to give advice with that. The other point that should be made is that the line hand or a spotter does not necessarily need to be an employee of the pump or boom operator. They can be somebody that may work for a placer that has been suitably instructed or advised of how to communicate with them whilst they're operating the boom. So there are a number of stipulations, but there are also options or recommendations that you can undertake. Moving on to section 6, which is probably the substantive area, and I'm going to spend a bit of time going through this part of the document with regard to inspection, assessment, maintenance, and repair. I think the important point that we wanted to note was that the manufacturers are an important element in the inspection, assessment, maintenance, and repair. They are the constructor or the designer or the developer of the piece of equipment, and their specifications must be considered. Having said that, there are, as we now know, many manufacturers that don't exist anymore, and there are pieces of plant that are operating across the world, not only just in Australia. And as a consequence of that, where those manufacturers' recommendations are not available or are not adequate, a competent person shall prepare those for that particular document. One of the points that we wanted to make was that maintaining good instructions or operational guidelines, maintaining good records through the use of logbooks, and recording those routine inspections, those assessments and maintenance or repairs is an excellent practice, and those shall be maintained where appropriate and available for any reader in English or any language that would be considered appropriate. Focusing on the relevant areas for major updates, however, they relate to logbooks for assessment and recording, pre-operational inspections or each use, which, as I mentioned earlier on, related to daily, routine inspections monthly, and periodic inspections will come to, as I said, see the criteria. And also in section 6, we've also expanded and improved, catered for both single and double wall pipes. As many of you would recall, the 1994 document really only addressed single wall pipe because double wall pipes weren't available in those days. So with regards to the logbook, and this is an extract directly from the standard, the logbook shall mandatory statement, where applicable, the serial identification, hours operated, and I'll qualify that a little bit later on, kilometres travel, daily, monthly and periodic inspections, adjustments and modifications, part renews, pipe wall thicknesses, boom and pedestal condition, outrigger beam and boxes, and safety equipment fitted. With regard to periodic inspections, and I'm just going to focus on that area because both daily and monthly are predominantly similar to the way they were structured in the 1994, and I think it's fairly self-explanatory in the document. But I believe that periodic inspections requires a little bit of additional attention. So I think as a scene setter, many of you would recall that we talked about the old standard being a rather prescriptive one, and looking at international standards like EN 12001 move towards a performance-based requirement or criteria. So using that as a framework, we've developed our periodic inspections to reflect a more performance-based, and let me explain how that works. So periodic inspections have to be conducted by a competent person, which is again defined within the document. It's clearly it's a means for early detection and repair of service damage. That's a really important element in this. Within the document, not only do we make reference to the manufacturer's requirements, which is spelt out in the manuals which are provided by the manufacturer, but we've also incorporated a detailed inspection table in Appendix B of the document, and I'll show you in a little while what that looks like. With regards to hours operated, let me just qualify that. In the document, we talk about operating hours meter is used to determine the hours of pumping concrete. That's not hours of driving the truck, that's not hours of the truck or the plant sitting on site and the engine running, but when it's pumping concrete. And that becomes the key determinant for the table which is in the document to determine when a periodic inspection has to be conducted. So let me just explain this rather detailed table, or at least information-filled table. On the vertical axis on the far left-hand side, we're talking about the concrete placing equipment inspections. So for pre-operational, routine, periodic, and then there's a criteria below that from 0 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, or more than 10 years. Each of these, however, are noted by an asterisk, but not less than once a year, and I'll qualify that in a second. Across the top, you'll see line pump, and then as defined, mobile boom and satellite placing boom. The preceding columns under each is the inspection criteria, each use. So if we look at 642 pre-operational, the inspection criteria needs to be conducted at each use. The competent person is detailed in clause 132.2. So the person that meets that definition, having the experience and qualifications, can undertake that each use. And I don't believe that has changed dramatically from the requirements of the 1994. The same for routine, which is conducted monthly. Again, the competent person to undertake that is detailed in clause 1323. Coming across the page, in terms of the inspection criteria for mobile boom pump and satellite, the same applies for each use and monthly, and the same competent person as defined down there. However, at the ages of 0 to 5 years, so a brand new piece of equipment, every 1,000 hours, but not less than once a year, a periodic inspection needs to be undertaken, and the person that can undertake that is defined in 1323. Please note that the person that is qualified to inspect a line pump is vastly different in terms of qualifications from a person required to undertake an inspection of a mobile boom pump defined at 132.4. And then as the pump ages in terms of its birth date, At 5 to 10 years, it's every 500 hours, and then more than 10 years, every 250 hours. Now, that mirrors what's in EN 12001, and in many regards, we have replicated those same criteria, however, made some adaptation of the competent person required to undertake those inspections. Let me just walk you through the stages of a periodic inspection, and it's again well detailed within this standard. But the first stage is initially an audit of the equipment logbook to determine that required daily and monthly inspections and maintenances have occurred, review the record of defects, and determine repairs are being carried out. Then you carry out the maintenance inspection requirements of the manufacturer or competent person has defined. In terms of the next steps is to complete the periodic inspection report, which is in the standard at Appendix B. Now, that 6-page report is not a single-page statement, but represents a record of the inspection that has been undertaken. It's not a strip down. There's no mandatory requirement to disassemble the complete pump or aspects of the pump, but to undertake an examination of the condition and components of the equipment, to take appropriate measurements of wear and tear of the equipment based on the manufacturer's specifications, and to take records, whether they be photographs, and attach them to a part of the report, but to really ultimately note down aspects of the wear and corrosion. So if you just bear with me for a second, I'm going to bring up the actual document and share with you an example of the report. Okay, so Appendix B, Periodic Inspection Report. Much of the information is fairly self-explanatory: manufacturer, serial number, year of manufacture, and then boom details, etc. Any particular additional features or modifications, and then you identify yourself as the person that's completed the record. In terms of general information, which forms part of the actual logbook, you need to obviously note elements of the superstructures. Now, this is to deal with a satellite or a separate placing boom and elements of the engineering related to that. Coming down, there is a schematic of a typical boom, and you'll note that there are numbers associated with elements. They reference sections of the pump as they relate to the report. And you can see here that elements 100 to 2000, for example, relate to manuals. 1500 to 2700 relate to hydraulic controls. 1600 to 47 electrical systems, so on and so forth. So when you look at elements of the support structure, each of them are detailed in a similar way, okay, for ease of identification. Now, in terms of the report, and for those of you that would be familiar with or have seen EN 12001, we've adopted a similar fault code method when completing the report. So I think you can all read for yourself, but there will be 00 right through to 31 for re-inspection required, and then you identify various states, I suppose, or fault codes for each element that you're reviewing within the inspection report. So for example, 01 would represent a crack, or paint would be 09, or a noise, a bearing noise, or would be considered to be 13. So again, within the report, and you obviously only are completing the report for the relevant piece of equipment, you would identify the fault code, the method of inspection. So obviously for a machine documents 100, an instruction handbook, whether it was present, method of inspection visually, acceptance criteria was if that was present, and any photographs or remarks that you might make. At the bottom of this standard, we've actually incorporated an example of how you may ultimately end up completing the report, just to give you some guidance. So, for example, for this work example, I've selected completed reports. So, for example, the item was 300, it was a pivot bearing, no fault code was given, the method of inspection was using a dial gauge, the acceptance criteria, which was probably specified by the manufacturer, was 0.15 millimeter. What was observed was 0.12, so the status was okay, but no photo was taken. But there are other examples where you would be looking at an extension box. There was some minor paint cracking, but no cracks were observed on the actual extension box itself. Status was okay, and a photo was taken to show that, which was again incorporated within that report. These are obviously matters for an inspector or a competent person considered to be undertaking and completing this report. The association is currently working on developing versions of this report which could be built into our logbooks and used by members and non-members alike.
Working in the construction industry is not without its risks. Pumping concrete is no different. The Concrete Pumping Association of Australia are here to help, working with national and state safe work authorities, Standards Australia and the construction sector. We are constantly working to update codes of practice and national standards to make your job safer. Coupled with our education and certification to increase your skills, we can help the concrete pumping industry strive to create higher quality workers as we seek to increase the overall safety of the industry. Members are the first to receive all the safety updates and even get discounts on certification courses and products from our online store. Logbooks, safety stickers, safety manuals, merchandise and more. To gain access to these exclusive deals, visit cpaassoc.com.au or call us today on 1300 136 636.
I'm going to bring us back to the presentation, continue on with our sort of summary of the key areas. So, as I said, the completion of the inspection report in terms of examination conditions. One of the important points that was noted by WorkSafe authorities on the committee was that there would need to be some disassembling allowed for a thorough examination in certain circumstances. But that didn't necessarily mean there was a mandatory requirement for the complete disassembly of the equipment. There also could be used in non-destructive testing, NDT, as directed by the competent person. Once those stages have been completed, the final stages were retesting of all safety functions, rectification of any defects that could affect the safety, assessment of suitability for continued service. Now again, the competent person would, based on the report, determine that these things need to be done immediately, these need to be done in the next 6 months, or these need to be done in the next 12 months from a risk hazard assessment. Then the competent person would issue a certificate and date that and authorize it as the competent person, and then make a statement for its continued operation and service. That, I believe, represents a major shift in thinking around the assessment, inspection, maintenance and repair of concrete placing equipment by using a performance-based approach where we're not pulling down brand new pieces of plant 6 years into service that may or may not have done a lot of service unnecessarily, but equally pieces of plant which are being used on a regular basis and seeing high levels of demand or use are being inspected more regularly. So that's where the performance-based approach is seen as relevant or applicable. In terms of the next section of summary of changes, we've got Appendix A, which is a mandatory warning safety signs, those have been extensively updated and expanded to incorporate modern signage and notification. For example, one new one that the association has included has been around crushing incidents with the folding back of outriggers. The periodic inspection report, as I've already gone through very quickly, an extensive update, 6-page report with fault codes, inspection methods used, observations, photos, and acceptance criteria. Appendix C, noise levels, D, incident types, and E, example certificates for continued service. So those kind of represent the elements of the document as changed. I'm going to just quickly summarize a couple of things which are coming up very soon. Now that the document's been published, we've been working on a number of fronts, but obviously been waiting for the document to be finalised. One has been an update of the existing printed copy logbook to incorporate those changes and new inspection reports. But coincident with that, the board has supported the development of a digital version or a mobile-enabled logbook, which will be available towards the mid part of this year in a full version, but we'll be getting a beta version out by the end of March. And we've already got a number of people signed up to help us out, but we welcome any more people that would like to be involved in that. And it will give you a significant advantage in terms of information sharing back to your respective people in the office. But more to follow on that in the coming months. With regards to more information, you can download your copy of the standard from the SIA Global website. Do not go to the Australian Standards website. They do not sell the standard. They are literally the portal for the management of code committees and the development of documents, and they tend to be a bit slow on updating their website with changes. So as at yesterday, I took a screenshot of the SIA Global, and I can assure you that 2550 Part 15 2019 is currently available on the website for the portly amount of about $249 or thereabouts. Lastly, the association has also got information with its website. Again, this is kind of like an overview of the things that I've spoken about today, but you can go to the website and have a look at the journey that we've been involved in and the people that have participated in that. Also, there's a hot link from there to the SIA Global to secure your copy of the standard. Now, we're going to try and review your questions, and we've got a couple there, but while Emma's just reviewing those questions, I'm going to just open up the call to my co-presenters, both David and Anthony, who've been sitting very patiently in the background. David, did you want to add anything to the material I've been through? And then whilst you're doing that, I'll have a quick look at the questions that we've got online at this stage.
To be honest, Craig, I think you've done an excellent job. I think it's very, very clear. I've been, following it through. I think it's important that people get themselves a copy of the standard and work through it, and if they haven't done already, and where questions arise, ask the question. But to me, it's very straightforward. So, look, I don't know. I'm curious to see what questions come up.
Thanks, David. Anthony, did you want to add anything to that whilst I'm still just reviewing these questions?
Yeah, I guess all I'd like to add to David's comments would be that we've lived this for the past few years, so it's all pretty close to us, but there are representatives in every state, and certainly if you have any questions or you're not sure, feel free to contact us at any time.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Craig,
Yes.
Craig, let me just add one bit that I was thinking as you were going through it. Look, concrete pumps first appeared in Australia in 1966. That was the very first pumps, hydraulic, the modern type of concrete pump as we know it. And it was 26 years later before the original AS 2550 Part 15 came into force. And the reason it came into force was there had been no regulation. It was largely unregulated. and there'd been a number of fatalities and very serious accidents because of booms. There was a lot of equipment that came in from Middle East and Southeast Asia second-hand in really poor condition, and for whatever reason, some failed and people were killed. There was a lot of different reasons. It's not just maintenance, partly setting up and what have you. But what I'm saying is that there was nothing for the first 26 years of concrete pumps, and now here we are 25 years later revising it, and the world has moved on considerably. We're probably about 2% of the world population for concrete pumps, Australia. So we've got to be mindful of what the rest of the world are doing and yet maintain the very highest levels of safety.
No, that's a good point, David. Thank you so much for that point of clarification and context where we fit into the global things. Look, a couple of questions. So one of the question is with regard to clarification on the mandatory two-man on a pump. Now, just let me be clear, there is no mandatory requirement of two-man on the pump. It's a recommendation. It's a should statement. And the question is we have an experienced operator using the remote and operating our booms independent. I think the point is that there is no mandatory requirement on two-man operation of a boom pump. It's a should statement and a recommendation that you have two people. The mandatory requirement with regard to operating under Section 5 relates to the pump and boom operator shall not handle the line end simultaneously. That's the issue. We don't want to see, or really the visual is a guy or a person operating a remote control and standing next to the tip and manipulating it. That's really where the mandatory requirement comes in. And I know that there are a number of people that have raised that with us in the past. And I know that some of our state regulators were pretty adamant that they wanted a mandatory requirement of two, but that has been wound back to a recommendation. And ultimately, we're talking about a valid risk assessment needs to be undertaken. You need to do an evaluation of the site and the constraints on the site. If you can't visually see the tip over a wall, you need to have a spotter or someone that can give you advice on how to move the boom safely.
Perhaps I could offer up two alternate examples, if that's all right.
Please, go for it.
Yeah, I guess the whole concept of needing a hosman comes back to more so, and one example is during a concrete pour where you may have a dozen or so concreters on the deck, it would be deemed unacceptable for the operator of the boom to also be manipulating or guiding the hose with one hand. One example of what would be or could be acceptable would be if you're out at a wind farm and you're pouring a base for a wind turbine, which is 600 or 700 cube, for example. You're parked up alongside the hole. There is no reason why you would need a hosman to purely pump concrete into a hole, similar to a culvert base or anything else. So I guess you'd need to exercise judgment, and as Craig has suggested, conduct the risk assessment and see whether it is safe to go either way.
Thanks, Anthony. I appreciate that. There's one general comment here, and I think I'll just sort of summarise it as the question's really about what is the time frame considered to be appropriate to implement this new standard or to become fully implemented. The standard is in effect from 21st of January 2019. Many people have asked the question, when should the first periodic inspection be conducted? You are all required to do a 12-monthly, and one would expect that from the last 12 monthly that you conducted, or if more recently a 6-yearly was completed, that would become the start date for you to look to conducting your first periodic inspection based on the performance criteria in Section 6. Another question that has been fired at me offline was with regard to once a periodic inspection, does the birth date get reset? No, if it's a 20-year-old pump, it's a 20-year-old pump. If it's a 10-year-old pump, it's a 10-year-old pump. It continues on from that date. So we don't grandfather the date from the original 6-yearly that was conducted. So it basically starts from the last major inspection that was conducted, whether it be a 12-monthly or a 6-yearly. There's another question with regard to clause 1.3.10, interlocking guards. Clarity on last sentence, please. Interlocking guards are designed to prevent the hazardous function of operating unless the guard is closed, e.g. power will shut off and moving parts of the machine are stopped if the guard is open. The hazardous function does not automatically start when the guard is closed. David, can you expand on that? Because this is one that we did rewrite a number of times. Can you expand on that for our question?
What it's about, and it's talking about
a stop switch or something like that.
Yeah, it's talking about it later somewhere too. It's the stored energy of an accumulator. In other words, it must dump the accumulator. It's basically, we're talking about the hopper grill, grate, whatever you call it. You lift it, and it must dump the accumulator, and not allow it to restart until the grate is down and the safety system on the machine has been re-tripped or reset, if you like. So in other words, you don't just put the grate down and then there's energy in there. So, we're basically talking about the accumulator. If you lift it, the agitator paddle should stop. If you put it down again, it's fine for the agitator paddles to start again because no one can get in there. But it's the stored energy that might inadvertently cut someone's fingers off or do something, which has happened a number of times, quite bad injuries by people not realising they've had the grate up and put it down again and they've fiddled around, and there's this stored energy in there that suddenly changes over for whatever reason and they've lost a part of a limb.
Yeah, no, I think I heard a number of examples during our standards committee. There's another question with regard to definitions. Simon's asked the question, is it okay for a pump operator to undertake a monthly inspection, which is 1.3.2.3, competent persons for routine inspections monthly. A trade person in the field, a fitter, mechanic, or person has completed training and gained specific experience in inspecting similar types of concrete placing equipment and their methods. I think the simple response, Simon, is that if that person, pump operator, has gained experience inspecting similar types of equipment, then they are considered to be competent. And as the business operator, it's your duty of care to be able to demonstrate that through your own records. I think there is a requirement for most people to at least evaluate that and look at the VOC's verification of competencies, ensure that their people are competent and verify their competency on a regular basis. Another question from Craig. What penalties are there in place if the operator is on the hose and moving the hose while pumping? Is it a fine for the operator and owner? Who will police this? Craig, my simple response to you, standards aren't laws that police and regulators will operate on. I think the simple response is that if a safe work inspector did see an operator managing the pump and handling the line end under this standard, they could seek to undertake a prosecution, and each of the states will have different penalties that would apply. They'd obviously have to prove the case, but who would police this? That would be safe work. I suspect that on any construction site, any informed builder or principal contractor in control of a site, if they're aware of these requirements, also might bring this to your attention. But ultimately, the association is not going to be sending people out to do inspectors. I don't believe that police will be involved in this. this will be one of those things that industry will sort of kind of self-regulate. And if people choose to avoid those requirements and an incident occurs, I'm sure that those agencies will undertake whatever prosecutions they believe are appropriate. Well, now we've got a question from Mark with regard to Queensland has recently released its new code of practice and differs substantially in some parts to this new standard. The code of practice has been withdrawn, but we will no doubt see somewhat amended version in the near future. Where these two documents differ, can we use compliance with the standard as safe system? Mark, good question. I'm not going to bore everyone with the more than 2 years of consultation with Queensland Office of Industrial Relations. The association board's been intimately involved in that. We have endeavoured to engage the Office of Industrial Relations. We offered the association's expertise to be involved in the committee. That was not taken up. We offered to make briefings about the work that we were doing within standards. Unfortunately, that wasn't taken up till right at the end game. As recently as sort of 48 hours ago, we've been in contact with the office to advise them that we're disappointed that they've chosen to republish a document which really maintains the status quo of mandatories. Queensland is now out of step with the rest of the country. Particularly New South Wales and Victoria were intimately involved in the development of this new standard, and we are extremely optimistic and hopeful that they will now commence a process of reviewing their own state practices and, where appropriate, make amendments, or work closely with the association towards us developing a nationally consistent code of practice. One of the major projects on the board's list of things to do, to publish in the next, hopefully within the end of 2019, and get the states to adopt. But Mark, your question is very much top of mind for us. What would happen in the near future? We've made it very clear to the Office of Industrial Relations in Queensland we welcome the opportunity to work with them to see elements of the Australian standard. I think in part much of the decisions made in the code of practice were due to the fact that they weren't involved in the standards development process and therefore weren't aware of the work that was being undertaken, and sound, well-researched and well-verified work. And maybe if that had happened, we wouldn't be in a situation where we now have a different document in Queensland. But the association is very much going to continue to work with all state regulators to help them understand the standard. We have a series of workshops we're doing in partnership with the Concrete Institute. The first of those will be in Queensland in late April. And one of our good friends in the association, Neville Barnes, will be presenting at that event, talking about many of the challenges for concrete pumpers, as well as talking about the new standards. So we will do our utmost to educate and inform people. I've got a question from Simon again on power lines. Figure 5.1. These safe distances differ from the Western Australian OH&S regs. We looked at all of the state regs as at probably 18 months ago, maybe 12 months ago, and we went for the lowest common denominator with them all and thought that that was where we looked to harmonise and look to best practice across the country. So I'll be interested to talk to you offline about your particular comment there and see if we can look at the specific reference. And if there is a conflict, we potentially could do an amendment to the document. I think that's all the questions. Thank you so much for the questions that you've shot through to us during this. It's difficult to sort of kind of take them in real time, but we've tried to do our best, I think. Again, for everyone that had registered and participated, thank you for your time. Really do appreciate your participation and being actively involved in the association and learning about what we've been, as an association, working to change with regard to Australian standards. Again, I'd like to thank both David and Anthony for their contribution, not only over the last couple of years, but their contribution today. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to the association. But we encourage you to, if you have people within your own organisation that would like to learn more, as a first port of call, could I encourage you to share the link that we'll put up online so that they can watch this webinar and answer as many questions as possible. And then if there are specific questions arising, again, feel free to reach out to us. On that note, I'll thank you for your time. Yep,
Great.
David?
I just got one thing, just while we've got everybody's attention. There's this question, it's not a question, but I think people might wonder about pumping hours, for this periodic inspection, right? I'll give you an idea that a big pump does about what we're talking is the actual pump cycling hours. Nothing to do with PTO hours, nothing to do with engine hours. So it means you need to get your hour meters sorted out, which most of the European machines are sorted out already, and most are, so that you're just getting pumping hours. Now, our experience is a big user would do about 400 to 500 hours a year maximum. We typically do a 100-hour service on a machine from a new machine, and it takes about 3 months for that to come up. Now, engine hours, way, way more. PTO hours, if you're running off a PTO hour meter, it's about pumping hours are maybe a third. But it's important that you measure the actual pumping hours.
All right, guys. Anthony, did you want to take the conch and say anything as a closing before we close it off?
I don't know how much more I can say, but I'll reiterate, as far as the association is concerned, any assistance we can provide or any clarity we could provide, feel free to make contact.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for everyone's participation. Spread the word. Spread the word. You're our biggest advocates. Get the message out there. Get it out to industry. Get them involved in the association, because the association is about doing together what we can't do alone. And when I go and speak to an agency, a regulator, and moreover, the broader industry, it's a powerful message when I can say that we are engaged with our members and they are speaking very unanimously about these changes, and we can get results for the industry. So have a wonderful Tuesday afternoon, and we'll talk soon.
Want to stay up to date on all things concrete pumping? The Concrete Pumping Association of Australia are here to help. We provide our members with locally relevant, current and industry-leading educational information, whether you're the owner, manager or employee, keeping members pumped up on the latest industry news, e-newsletters, standards updates, events, technical publications, safety alerts, financial benchmarking studies and the annual Concrete Pumping Mag. You'll be the first to find out. Joining is easy. Why not become a member via our online store, cpaassoc.com.au, or call us today on 1300 136 636.